It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, hello and welcome again to another episode of Islands at War. I'm Keith Bengelli and
Nick Lahure. Hi.
Great to be with you again. So we now reach, Nick, June 1941.
We've covered a year already.
Yeah, and there's some interesting stuff to get through. Some of the usual format, but more military items to be covered off, and also how the Germans handled the Jewish question here in the bailiwick. But Nick, we're going to go into our thing that was subject that would have been most people's minds, of course, is food and beverages and drink, etc.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was interested in was you and I grew up hearing from our families that tea was being made from blackberry leaves, etc.
Yeah.
And of course, what came up in my mind, and we've answered it, is the fact that, well, yes, but what was the source? Who picked these leaves, etc.? So we know that the leaves were sent to bakers for drying, and the leaves, having been dried, went to a special aid shop and people could buy them as if they were buying tea leaves. But Nick, tell us about how the blackberry leaves were actually harvested.
Yeah, so it is another case of necessity being the mother of invention, people having to adapt and come up with alternatives for the things that they just couldn't get. So when you mentioned this to me and you said, what's the story here? Who did the collecting? What on earth was going on here? I had ages ago gone into the Imperial War Museum archive and listened to an interview with Dorothy Hurrell-Longley, who lived here at the time. And I had a vague recollection there was something about blackberry leaves in there. So I went back and checked my notes. And sure enough, she did talk about it. So I went back and listened to that again. And she used to go out collecting leaves. So it was individuals used to go and do this.
But they were tasked with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think they did it off their own bat, to be honest. You probably got some to keep for yourself.
Yes, of course, yeah.
But the rest went to the special aid shop in the high street. Now, I don't know where that was. I found a few references to it, just know it was in the high street, which operated kind of like a charity shop. So I suspect what happened is you got a bit of them to keep for yourself, and the rest went there. So you got your ersatz tea.
Yeah.
But she used to go out and collect them, but also she records that she used to cycle out to the country schools and enlist the help of the children from the schools there. They were allowed out to come and help her to collect all these blackberry leaves to get them and take them to be dried out. They actually moved on to roses when roses were in season. They were drying out rose leaves.
This is rose. Yeah, so this is rose leaves, not rose petals.
Bit of both, by the sounds of it.
I think so.
A bit of both from what I've read. And then she used to take them along to the baker, and they put them in and dry them out, and that was that. Now they did similar things as well, where they were trying to make substitutes for tobacco and various other bits and pieces like that as well. So yeah, that's just kind of what happened there. There was a letter in the press in June 1941, where somebody had actually written in and they were complaining that people were taking too many blackberry leaves. And as I was saying before we started recording, it kind of strikes me that they were ahead of their time in terms of preserving stocks of things like we talked about the Ormers in May 1941 episode about the ban on taking Ormers. And there were various things where people, were writing in and saying, look, don't take too many, only take what you need, because otherwise there won't be enough when it comes to next. Yeah,
so there was a degree of altruism here that was really about preserving for next year as opposed to preserving for future generational.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was a slightly different focus. Also, we talk about this, where this special aid shop may have physically been in the high street of St. Peter Port, but as you mentioned, or possibly mentioned later on, shops were closing down because there was nothing to sell, and this shop sounds like it was like a pop-up, what we would know as a pop-up shop now.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly that sort of thing, because barter shops sprung up because people had nothing to sell. They couldn't get fresh supplies in to sell. All the stuff that was coming in from France was all controlled because that was all food and things like that, and occasionally other goods as well, which could be sold, but very rarely. So yeah, they had to do something, and you see all the adverts in the paper as well. But it was May 41 that officially sort of barter shops started appearing, and that's recorded in the Guernsey press, and it just kind of goes from there. But people were already unofficially bartering for things. You see people who obviously don't smoke who got their cigarette ration offering cigarettes for realty if anybody had any left by then, which we know from Reverend Ord was fairly rare for anybody to have some, because he got the last cup of tea down at Lancrass in May 1941 from the place where he'd telephoned ahead to order.
Yes, I mean, nowadays, when was the last time you had a decent fillet steak? And it was nice in those days. It was when you last had a decent cup of tea. It really was like that.
Yeah, and meat was a real problem at this stage as well. They were going for long periods of time with no meat, just because or very little meat ration.
So no protein.
Yeah, again, as we talked previous, they were getting like 6 ounces or 4 ounces as their ration for the week.
Yes, it's unimaginable nowadays.
So, a small beef burger, basically.
Yeah, very small. And I see here the fish ration down to 8 ounces of wet fish and 1 pound of shellfish per person per week. But this is almost aspirational, right? Because you had to actually find that pound of shellfish. I mean, you couldn't, it wasn't handed out to you. There were huge queues in the market. And we had an appointment of a fish controller, which I think we discussed last month as well.
Yeah, chap called. If you've listened to the May 1941 episode, we talked about the fact there was a big fuss in the newspaper. The Chamber of Commerce were complaining about, it wasn't being organised properly in terms of people being able to get fish, particularly if they lived out of town and they weren't going fishing themselves, etc. So there were various arguments put forward. And they officially appointed Mr. Bertram Bartlett as fish controller, and his duties were to deal with supplies when they reached the market, because they didn't always reach the market.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Because, the weather might have been bad. The Germans wouldn't let them out in bad weather because they were worried about people doing a runner, which they frequently did if it got misty and they were out there. And so the Fish Advisory Committee, acting for the controlling committee, will continue to consider matters affecting fishermen and their vocation. And in the same edition of the press, actually, they talk about, there's an article called Objects of Interest, and it talks about all the crowds gathering round when fishermen do turn up. Before the fish even gets to the market, they're not allowed to buy it from the fishermen, but they're just turning up to see it actually arriving. Lots of dogfish, ray and conger predominantly in the cargo, so not particularly fish I'd fancy eating. I mean,
I've eaten them.
Dogfish is not one that humans normally eat. Really.
Well, my background, even in the 60s, we didn't have a lot of money, and I've had conger on the basis as you ate conger for tea, or you had nothing.
Or you had nothing, yeah. And there was another letter as well in the paper, so it kind of ties in with what we were talking about with the Chamber of Commerce and that kicking up a bit of a fuss about things. And a chap called Mr. W.G. Elliott actually wrote into the paper on the 18th. Well, it was published on the 18th of June. And he had a suggestion to help out with people out in the country parishes getting supplies of fish. And he said, what you should do is, number 1, install a depot in each parish. 2, the public to purchase their fish in the parish in which they reside. Brackets, but not shellfish. I'm not sure why he was, putting shellfish as being immune from that. And then he said the third thing you need to do is work out for each parish the percentage of residents in relationship to the town, and then you divide it up fairly amongst those people. And he says if you've got 10 depots, you get 10 containers, and as the fish arrive each day, distribute according to the chart, place it in the containers and send them to the parish ice house to await the delivery to retailers. And he says he's hoping this will pave the way for an equal distribution.
Well, there were fish depots set up around that time, one in St Martin's, one in St Andrews, and St Saviour's and Tortable. So certainly in that month 4 were set up. And I suppose by the time you also would have had fish outlets in St Thomas's and St Peter Port. For people that don't know the geography of Guernsey, what we're suggesting here is that they were sort of set out quite sensibly geographically.
Yeah, and of course the flip side of it for the town residents, they might have had it good when it came to the fish market to start off with, but when things got really bad later on, they had nowhere to grow vegetables. So the people that lived in the country parishes had more chance of getting a little bit extra because they could grow stuff for themselves.
Indeed, and in fact, what we see here being two of the items that were available at the time were parsnips and radish. I mean, that's your main meal, but of course, it doesn't mean to say that there were unlimited amounts of parsnip or radish. And I think you've got another example here of Dorothy Hurrell Longley with a remembrance of hers.
Yeah, she's again in the same interview that I listened to about the blackberry leaves. She said, "I know of my mother going to the market, queuing up for 4 hours, and coming home with one parsnip for 6 of us in the family, and then you would go out blackberrying." So, what can you imagine that one parsnip between 6 people? This was a real problem for people. They were really suffering already. You're a year into the occupation, and
yeah, I mean, it defies understanding that a family of 6 would just carve up a parsnip. It sounds like something from Blackadder, but this would have been something that was bought on market day.
Yeah,
and that one would have hoped that there was something to supplement it, like some bread or
or something else,
some hot tea or something. People would have died earlier through malnutrition.
Yeah, people were already dying by this point. They had been for some months. There's one of the doctors that was here, Dr. Sutcliffe. He was recording already, that people were dying because they were basically getting, if they were lucky, about 800 calories a day. Generally speaking, for the average chap, you need about 2,000.
Yeah,
slightly, slightly less if you're not doing manual labour. There were distinctions in the rationing between people who were doing manual labour. But the problem was, okay, you might have your ration book with your coupons. You might wait 4 hours, get to the front of the queue, and they go, "Sorry, we've run out of everything."
Yeah, we see my grandmother had a house full, because the men had gone off to war, had a house full of toddlers, my father and aunt, also 3 oldies, her mother and father and her father-in-law, and 2 of those 3 did succumb to malnutrition, but not till 1944. So we're 3 years in advance of this.
Yep.
So it's amazing that she managed to keep them alive for as long as she is, for another 3 years. It must have been absolute hell. It must have been torture. There's this gradual, unrelenting starvation. Okay, so we also see here that a cheese ration was being made available to expectant and nursing mothers who must actually guarantee to eat it themselves and not give it away.
Yeah, that was provided by the Red Cross. That was the French Red Cross supplied that, and obviously, that was vital for helping those expectant mothers. Hence, why it was, you mustn't give it away. You mustn't, it was a very limited supply.
So it was almost a prescription drug.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. Because they weren't, as we talked about last month, the milk looked just like, slightly whitewash. Yeah, slightly
emulsion.
White water.
Yeah. Herbert Winterflood, who wrote a book about 30 years ago, the late Herbie Winterflood, he had an extract where he was talking about the food centres are now flourishing around the island. In 4 days, the centre in St Martin's, over 1,000 people called in for food. And I'm convinced that my grandmother would have, we were a St Martin's family during the war. Just tell us how these worked, Nick.
Yeah, so these were food distribution centres, but you also had the restaurants that we talked about, which they very rapidly, they'd been going for a couple of months by this point, having started out in St Sampson's and then started spreading to other parishes.
But to call them restaurants is a bit over the top, because you didn't go in and say, "Look, I'd like to order from the menu." You sat down and you got a meal.
Yeah, basically, you had to go up to the counter, and it was because they didn't have room. They crammed in so many tables just to be able
for efficiency.
For efficiency, that you had to go up and collect your meal. But the alternative was, they very quickly worked out, takeaways.
Yeah.
If you can't get in to sit down, well, you can have a takeaway to take back home and eat or whatever. So it was a mixture of the two. You had food rationing centres and those more of a cafeteria than a restaurant. Yeah, well, they were described as restaurants in the newspaper articles.
Yeah, well, again, looking through the prism of my family, my grandmother would have gone down to fetch it, leaving the oldsters to look after the children, and she would have taken the food back. She wouldn't, she wouldn't have been able to take the whole extended family down there. So that's how it would have worked for her.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Other aspects of life for civilians in the bailiwick, if one was to stay away from home, even for one night. So let's say, for example, you'd had a family birthday and you got together and decided to stay over. One had to go down to the Greffe. Now, the Greffe is part of our government. It exists to this day. It's the sort of administrative arm of the government. All marriages and deaths, etc., records are kept at the Greffe. It's like a town council, municipal
registrars, or
registrar,
that sort of thing.
So you actually had to go to St. Peterport, go to the Greffe office, and fill a very, very elaborate form out just to stay one night, or it could be longer, but even one night. So the Germans theoretically knew where you were.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's just another example of the Germans just wanting absolute control of everything. We've talked in previous episodes where, they were issuing 40 orders in one day, which is just absolutely mind-blowing. How you kept up with them. And as Ord and others point out, some of those orders are just completely ridiculous. We talked about one which was talking about, diamonds for tool cutting and things like that.
Yeah. But of course, with this, it raises two questions in my mind. One is, did it inhibit people going and doing this, staying over, or did they just simply ignore it and not go and register and just take a chance?
Yeah, I think there was quite a bit of ignoring it and just taking a chance, because you don't really see very many references in people's diaries to, I had to go to the Greffe because I was going to go and stay with my relatives down at Varzon. You just don't really see it. So I think basically they just pretty much ignored it. Now, at varying times in the war, the curfew was enforced in different ways. It depended on how bothered the Germans were about what was going on at the time.
And the time of year as well.
Yeah, exactly. Were the troops a little bit lazy? They tended to concentrate on, patrolling the roads around the coast, or around where German officers and troops were billeted. Those were, quite
sensitive areas.
Yeah, sensitive areas, that sort of thing, rather than, just being out all over the island all of the time. Now, there were times when they were all over the shop because they were worried about what was going on. They thought, there might be a commando raid or stuff like that. So there were plenty of accounts where people said, well, I didn't really pay much attention to the curfew during the following months or whatever. Or they talk about the fact that, the patrol has gone down from being 20 men that are out enforcing the curfew in their parish to being like 6 of them. Then they're not, they're not carrying their rifles very well. They look very slovenly, and they just don't look very interested in what they're doing at all. And so, they were relatively easy to evade at those times. Other times, when they were on alert, then it was much more difficult.
Yes, and of course the practicality of staying with your brother-in-law or your aunt or something is you had to take your rations with you. You didn't go and live off somebody's hospitality. You had to take with you the food that you were going to consume, because where you were going to stay was in no position to offer you hospitality. Okay, there might have been a bottle of whiskey for you to have a nip of whiskey, but in terms of food, you took what you were going to consume.
Yeah, absolutely. There might be a little bit of hospitality depending on what stage of the occupation it was at. Somebody might have somehow made a cake using horrible flour and whatever other ingredients they could get. But generally speaking, you had to take your own stuff with you.
Okay, and then also I noticed that there was a report in one of the diaries that the amalgamated laundries announced that they will have to close down at the end of the month because there was a lack of soap. Yeah.
Soap supplies was a massive problem from relatively early on. I don't know if that's because the Germans didn't really think it was something that, the local populace needed, or whether it was just a case it was very difficult to obtain it from France. As we know, sometimes getting some goods from France, they weren't very willing to flog it to the representatives that were over there. So, don't know. But, as we said, lots of shops closed down because they had nothing to sell. And, the diaries note that there are fewer queues in town as there's not a lot open, and the largest queue is the fish market. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, but when coming back to this problem of the lack of soap in it, and it was both in terms of for personal use and also for the laundries to operate on a commercial basis. I mean, just trying to keep yourself clean, just trying to keep yourself levels of hygiene up. Things like, around shaving, and there are issues around, as I say, personal hygiene, and people must have been a bit ripe at times. There was no, especially people working hard, and there was no just simply, I'll take my overalls off, just pop them in the washing machine.
Exactly, and you had the problem of heating water as well.
Yes,
to be able to have a bath or whatever, or even just to get the firewood if you were using a tin bath in front of your fire in the lounge. As we talked last month, that it was banned. You weren't allowed to have use coal to heat your house. I mean,
sometimes it's so invigorating to have a hot shower or a hot bath, and it makes you feel better. And the complete absence of this, any type of luxury at all, it was really brings it home.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the food thing as well, I've got an entry here from an unpublished diary that I'm looking at the moment, and they record on the 7th of June that the food situation here is getting worse. No meat again this week. In consequence, the German regulations on fishing and fishermen supply is only about a quarter of what is necessary to give everyone £0.5 per week head. And the bread ration is also too small and is likely to be smaller soon. Our main diet is vegetables, coffee and tea substitutes, and in most cases, beastly beverages. The annoying part of the whole business is that the Germans and their nationals get first pick and double the rations on nearly all foods, tobacco, etc. The laundries are closing down next week owing to depletion of stocks of soap and other materials in order to run their businesses.
Yes, and so all aspects of there's just no comfort to be had at all, no luxury to be had. It's just, I suppose, the comfort of the company of your own family is about the only thing that you've got. And of course, we were even talking about the start of the summer of 1941 being particularly rubbish when it comes to weather as well. So people were still cold. And of course, if you're fatigued and tired, which we'll get onto a little bit later, you're going to feel colder.
Yeah, and the weather there was an article in that edition of the Guernsey Press saying that the weather in May had been the worst for 98 years.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we saw this later on in other theatres of the war, just at the 1944 after D-Day, winter of 1945. It just so happens that the winter is at its worst at the worst possible time for everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about June 1941 here on Islands at War with myself, Keith Bengali, and Nick Lahuri. A lot of the information that we extract is from newspapers and diaries, I think you're probably aware by now. And the Reverend Ord, Methodist minister who lived on the island, who elected to stay on the island, fluent German speaker, he records that it is 1 year since he had started to keep his journal. And he also records that many members of the military, especially the army, are less confident about the war's outcome. So just a little bit of backstory here. Ord, as I say, was a Methodist minister. He was minister on a circuit of the Methodist chapels around Guernsey, but predominantly at the one in Brock Road, which is called, can't remember what it's called, Nick, the main one that's being redeveloped at the moment.
Ebenezer,
it was Ebenezer. Anyway, he was a fluent German speaker, as I say, because he'd been captured in World War I, a POW, and he learnt German. He was a very applied gentleman, and many Germans were attending his services, and many of them educated men, and because of the fact that he was seen to be a safe pair of ears, many expressed horror at the way that the war was turning out, and they confided in him, and the fact he could speak German, it was easier to communicate. And there was a lot of expressed negativity towards Hitler personally, wasn't there, Nick?
Yeah, there was, very, very much so. And again, in this unpublished diary that I'm looking at, he says, heard authentic story of German officer who read extracts of a letter from his wife in Germany to effect that people are on the verge of a revolution. This again may be the opinion of one woman.
But she expressed it and was prepared to express it with presumably the knowledge that her letters could have been censored or looked at any rate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so the German army here, the German military, not quite as confident even in those early days. And bear in mind, of course, that they hadn't yet invaded the Soviet Union. The Americans weren't yet in the war.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it was a lot of Germans getting very worried very early on. So that's an interesting observation. Maybe it's because we're at a remove here. The Channel Islands are at some remove from the fighting. So it's interesting to pick up on that.
I think as well. I think we've talked about this before, but the Germans that were here in the early days, a lot of them were well disciplined, old school military men, particularly the officers. So a lot of them were very highly educated. And
to a degree, Anglophiles as well.
Yeah,
they were very well
absolutely
predisposed to
the chap who was the censor here at this point in the war had been at Cambridge University, and he got caught up in things because he went back to Germany to see his family from Cambridge University, and then war broke out.
And press ganged into the army, into the military.
Exactly. So you had a lot of very intelligent people, and as I say, old school Prussians and things like that. Now that obviously changed as time went on, but so maybe they had a slightly different view to others.
Yes, well, of course, we don't touch on it particularly, apart from to say that it was during this month in 1941, I think it was the 22nd of June, that the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. And of course, a lot of the soldiers that were here, I think, were rotated out eventually to the Russian front. Yeah,
because they were good quality troops, and they started getting replaced by older. You see this time and time again, recorded in diaries, that it was older men turning up here, replacing the younger, the ones that looked like the really young.
Stormtrooper.
I don't want to say elite. That's not. It's an overused word when it comes to this. But the well trained younger men that you would traditionally expect to be in the military of any nation started getting replaced by older men as time went on, and ending up on the Russian front.
Yeah, and in fact we did, or Ord refers to an increase in troop strength, but of course an increase in troop strength doesn't necessarily mean an increase in quality troops strength or military strength. It means, as you say, that they're starting to rotate in the older or the very, very young, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Ord also writes about how, because he moves from chapel to chapel various times in the week to take Methodist services, he writes about how tired he and others are becoming due to the lack of shortage of food, calories, and Ord has to travel by bicycle or on foot between these various chapels, and he lived on the outskirts of St. Peter Port, which it made many of his journeys uphill on the way home, and he talks about just being so stone tired halfway through a journey, wondering how he's going to get home eventually. And he writes that often people are found just sitting or lying in the street due to fatigue.
Yeah, and it's back to the fact they're just not getting enough to eat, to be able to keep themselves going.
Yeah, and he records that one lady is actually fished out of the sea unconscious, and after coming round, says she remembers feeling faint and dizzy, and says she simply fell into the water.
Fell into the water, yeah.
Lucky she was fished out. Moving on to certainly more serious and sinister matters, Nick. The anti-Jewish measures that were prevalent in the Channel Islands as a whole, not just the bailiwick, because there was a difference between the way the few people of Jewish origin in Guernsey, there were Jewish people in Jersey, and the way they were treated is slightly different. It just should be said that the Jewish people in Guernsey, who were all commemorated, all remembered, were people that had come to work here in the hospitality sector or as nannies, etc., and got stranded here. Yeah. Whereas in Jersey, of course, we actually had a sort of middle-class merchant class of people that had shops in St. Helier But we were talking before that we think they must have got away. I mean,
well, some of them got away, others didn't. But this was the third order that came out, which was issued on the 17th of June, 1941. Now, these orders all came from France, and they were passed down to the Kommandantur here. Essentially, all of these orders were just trying to alienate the Jewish population from the rest of the population. They were trying to, alienate people from them. But this one really sort of steps things up because, as I was saying, we're looking at the Jersey archives, these orders made them do was basically you weren't allowed to run a business, you weren't allowed to own shares in a company, you weren't allowed to have a high status job, basically, and it placed the onus on people to basically say, I've got so and so working for me. Now, not all of them did dob people in, but also the Germans just went around and were like, well, we think this business is run by a Jewish person. Basically, prove you're not.
I.e., so if we think you're guilty, you've got to prove yourself innocent.
Yeah, basically. And looking at the Jersey archives, they've got things like I saw I was looking at this point the other day, and I saw an affidavit from somebody basically swearing an affidavit saying that their grandparents on one side weren't Jewish, and they had one Jewish member of their family in there somewhere back in the history and whatever. So they weren't counted as being a Jewish person by the German authorities. But what they were doing with this order, it's just absolutely awful. And of course, we know things got far worse. But they were basically any business that they decided, well, that's got a Jewish connection, they were appointing an administrator to sell that business, and the Jewish person was not allowed to receive any of the money. I can only imagine that the money went to the Germans; it won't have gone anywhere else. And so, they were losing their income. They had no way of supporting themselves.
Did this happen? It didn't happen in Guernsey because we didn't have any people of Jewish origin that were business owners here. As I say, the people that we know about, the young women that were rounded up and sent to camps and did die, they were here because they had taken jobs here. But in Jersey, it was different, as I say. So,
it was slightly different scenario, although there were people in the same situation as Guernsey was. There may have been people in Guernsey that had experienced this same thing as well. It's just that I haven't come across anything to do with that at the moment.
But you have got here a letter from the German commander regarding the wearing of the Jewish star. That's a universal order throughout the Channel Islands?
Yeah, the order was the same throughout the Channel Islands because it was promulgated from France. The original order is written in German and French. You can, if you subscribe to the Jersey Archive, you can go and look at the various orders. They're scanned in on there. The orders are printed in German and French, come from the German High Command in France, and they were sent here, and then they were forced to introduce them. Now the Germans also used this law to basically go around looting.
Yes,
they went around seizing stuff, even from businesses that and. They weren't being too particular. They were just using it as an excuse to go and steal stuff, basically. So Le Riche had 90,000 cigars taken, which at that point in the war, tobacco was very, very scarce. I'm not quite sure how come there were still 90,000 cigars. Maybe they were just eking them out with the rations. I don't know. But they had those stolen.
So Le Riche, for people not au fait, particularly with Le Riche, exists to this day, and they have supermarkets here. But they're not a firm of Jewish origin at all. The Germans were using this as a pretext, simply just to loot.
Yeah. And I mean, this is just reading this order. I found it actually looking at the stuff in the archives just very, very upsetting. When you see some of the stuff that's in there, it's just awful. Yeah.
I mean, in some respects, we may be surprised that it took them a full year to get round to doing this.
Well, they started pretty early. The first order, I think, was September or October 40, and it just, as I say, things.
So it's being reinforced here from headquarters probably in Paris.
Yeah.
Okay, and of course they're embedding this into local law.
Yeah.
They're forcing our law enforcement. Our statute books effectively.
Yeah.
To carry anti-Jewish legislation.
Now, one thing that is quite sad is Ord notes in his diary that our 3 Jews are safe in England, because there was a general feeling amongst the people here that, they all thought, they've all managed to get away. Unfortunately, they hadn't got away in the evacuation. There were some, as you say, that which sadly ended up in camps and died and are commemorated.
Yeah, and there's some controversy around, as with most things like this, that our government was in some way actively complicit in the rounding up of people. But I don't think the ladies that we're referring to in particular were rounded up. They themselves went and registered, didn't they? Which is not exonerating anybody, but this is simply how it worked.
Yeah, and I don't know the exact mechanics of it, but the local authorities were asked to provide a list. Most of the accounts from people that were involved in that say, well, we thought there weren't any here. Some people say, well, they should have known because aliens had to be registered here before the Germans actually arrived. So maybe they should have known. But how do you find out? There's you're not got a computer system to go and have a look. It's very difficult. And and even if you do find these people in your records, do you know if they've gone away or not?
Yeah.
Do you know if they're using a different name or whatever? So it's a very controversial area, and I don't think we'll ever know
No, and one of the ladies that did go on to perish lived half a mile from where we're sitting at the moment. So when one passes the house that she was employed in, I often think about her, poor lady.
Yeah.
Moving on, a memoriam notice in the press, because we are 1 year on, which means we're 1 year on from the terrible air raid on St. Peter Port and, of course, St. Helier.
Yeah.
A lot of people perished directly on the day of the raid, killed outright, and we are also becoming more aware of the amount of people that probably perished in the months afterwards. Some months afterwards, there were no antibiotics. It was pretty gruesome, the scene at the time. So many people would have suffered post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a memoriam notice in the press on the anniversary at the end of June, and the diarist notes that many black ties were worn, and Lovell's window in black and white attracted a lot of attention. Black bows and ribbons were tied around flower vases in tea rooms and restaurants.
Yes, I mean, I had occasion to look for something in the cemetery records at the archives and came across the notices of one of the parishes, the amount of people that they lost on that day. And the Germans just simply seemed to just ignore it. It was of no consequence to them.
Yeah, they wouldn't have been bothered.
Okay, again, moving on, ID cards. The loss of ID cards brings fines of about 5 shillings. You've got a sort of semi-humorous story about this, and also I think you've got some examples of people actually losing or mislaying their cards.
Yeah, because they got reported in the paper that they reported a lot of the court cases were in the paper, much as they are today, to be fair. And it obviously printed as a warning to people that this is what will happen to you if you lose your ID card. You get caught out, without your ID card, and you get fined. But also, we talked last month about they started taking photographs for the ID cards.
Yeah.
Before May 41, they didn't have a photograph on. It was just an ID card without a photo, and we talked about that last month. And it was still going on. We're in June 41, still going on. They've moved on to Sunbury Park. They're doing all the people in the photo census, they like to call it, not anything else more sinister. And there was one chap there who objected to having his photograph taken, but he got caught out because they managed to surreptitiously get his photograph. So he didn't get away with it, but they did over 2,000 people had their photo taken in the Cattell, 2020. But the same article talks about 4 dates for the Vale folk. So, it warns people that where they've got to turn up and if they live in the parish of the Vale, to go and have their photo taken. But there was also, I don't have a copy of the article, but it is referred to in her Winterflood's book as, a few days later, there was the slightly alarming headline which said 480 Vale residents shot, which, generally speaking, you'd probably assume that meant they were actually shot with some form of firearm, not had
massacred,
not had their picture taken, which was in fact what the story was about. The fact that on the first day they'd taken 480 photographs.
And we're actually sat in the Vale parish right now. And I did say that I would tweet on our Twitter account a picture of my grandmother's ID card, and I haven't yet done that, but I will do that in the next few days. Okay, well, we move on to matters military. More and more troops, as we previously referred to, more and more troops arriving with thousands of tons of cement as the islands are fortified, in line with as we've said, Hitler's personal insistence.
Yeah, absolutely. He demanded plans on the 2nd of June because he wanted to see maps of the islands' defences, and then on the 13th of June he orders reinforcement of the islands. Now, this isn't the wholesale fortress order, which is later on.
That's in October. So this is a different. We're making it, and this is important, I think, to note that the fortifications of the Channel Islands, which may have been strategically completely wrong-headed, it was at Hitler's insistence, and is ahead of what is known as the Atlantic Wall.
Yeah,
we were a precursor. The Channel Islands were a precursor to the Atlantic Wall. Yeah,
so they were ramping up the amount of troops here, and also starting to build concrete structures, which we'll come to in a minute. But in the diary I was looking at the other week, they were talking, and I've looked at a couple of sources, and they're all talking about the people are talking about there's going to be 10,000 Germans by the end of next week, being the end of June. And this diarist says he spoke to German officers who were bemused why they're building up such strength in the Channel Islands. There is a consequence to this as well. So what's generally been happening up till this point, not exclusively, but a lot of Germans have been billeted in places like the Imperial Hotel or the Duke of Richmond, which is a very nice hotel in St. Peter Port, and they've been billeted there. Now, they started moving out and billeting themselves in private dwellings in June as part of a consequence of, well, there was a couple of reasons. Firstly, they basically trashed the place. So the Duke of Richmond was in a very, very sorry state after they...
Yeah, and this is a prestige hotel now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Much changed, of course, much changed. And you mentioned the Imperial Hotel. That's not too different to what it used to be like. That's way out on the sticks. That's way out in the southeastern.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure where all these men slept. They must have had lots of bunks in rooms, because they talk about there were 100 Germans in the Imperial Hotel. And I think it's got like 10, 15 bedrooms there. It's not, but I suppose if they'd taken over a lot of the common areas, you probably could fit 100 people in if you weren't too fussy about whether, Hans was just 2 feet away from you or whatever.
His feet were, not his hands.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that happened was, now, a lot of the high-ranking German officers had taken over the more prestigious houses in St. Peter Port and around the
suburbs and such,
and the suburbs. But there was more pressure for that to happen, and basically everyone in Queen's Road was kicked out. That started to happen in May, but they were kicked out of their houses at in some cases, the Germans came round at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning and said, you've got until 4 o'clock. And Ord actually talks about one instance where he witnessed where one of his neighbours, the Germans rocked up, I think it was 10 o'clock in the morning, said, you've got until 4 o'clock and then you're out. You can only take whatever you can get out of the house by then. And basically they ended up with a human chain of people putting stuff into a horse-drawn cart. And the German NCO was very officious and had absolutely no sense of humour, and was, basically 4 o'clock, that's it, stop. It was like, some sort of one of those game or musical chairs, I suppose.
Yeah, or it's a knockout.
Everybody sit down, or it's a knockout, something like that, but far more serious, obviously. And that, but quite often they weren't allowed to take the furniture anyway. It was if the Germans took a shine to, if you had a nice house with lots of nice furniture, there was pretty much no chance you were going to be allowed to take it with you.
And in some cases, if they wanted the house vacant possession, you had to take everything, and how you got rid of it is up to you. It was quite brutal. We know that where Reverend Ord lives, which is, for those of you who know Guernsey, lived at the top of the Rohays, and we know that he had senior Kriegsmarine staff billeted next to him at one point, the staff that were in charge of communications, Kriegsmarine communications. That's German Navy. Willy Hagedorn, for example, who was who actually I think did live next to
I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly where he lived. Actually, that's not.
He makes a point of in one of the diary entries of being out on the balcony at the front of the house, which is still there, and a senior German officer walked out onto his balcony. They nodded at one another, and I've seen it referred to somewhere. It was actually Willy Hagedorn, but nevertheless, he himself was having to live right next to German officers. I mean, German officers were never billeted in my house, but they certainly billeted next door. And the retaining wall between our two properties is German cement.
And part of the build-up as well was the Germans started bringing tanks over as well. Now,
yes, I saw that.
If you're familiar with the island, it's not a very suitable place, even back then, for driving around, even in a little tank.
Yeah.
You know, they were captured French tanks, so FT-17s and Char B1s were also they were First World War tanks that they'd captured.
I think I'm right in saying that it was one tank division split in two. One half was in Jersey and one half was here.
Yeah, a couple of tanks ended up in Alderney as well.
Yeah, and the only division never to fire a shot in anger.
Yeah,
quite probably. I think on the way. Well, they didn't come down as a regiment, did they? The fall of France. I think that they must have been more just.
They were formed up after that, and this first reference, I should have checked actually, because I have got a book about tanks in the Channel Islands, but I forgot to check before I came down. But basically, these are tanks from 1917.
First World War tank.
They're quite small. I've got some pictures actually. There's one in the Tank Museum, which actually came from the Channel Islands and ended up in the Tank Museum. I had an interesting chat with them about that. They're not quite sure how they got their hands on it, but at some point it made its way to them, because most of them at the end of the war were returned to France, the ones that were still in one piece. Yeah, because the Germans.
They cannibalised them. They had to.
They cannibalised them and stuff like that. So I can put some pictures up of those tanks so you can see what they like. But they weren't very reliable. They didn't have an awful lot of spare parts for them. So, in this instance, they're recording that, by the town church, they saw two tanks that had broken down, and talks about the fact that they were old, 1917 ones.
Yeah, and I like also, as we go into the last 10 minutes of our June 1941 podcast, Ord talks about some of the bigger fortifications coming together. Now, Batterie Strassburg, which is on a headland that is to the south of St. Peter Port, at a height of, 280, 300 feet as cliffs. There wasn't gossip at the time that they thought they were building submarine pens at the foot of these cliffs, of an outrageous observation. But in fact, Batterie Strassburg, could you give us a little bit of, you've got quite a lot of detail here, and I think for people that are interested in military matters, especially, this was not a small, this was quite a big battery. It covers a big area, and you can see this today, can't you?
Yeah, I mean, there's 64 structures up there. It was not long ago. It was made of
significant structures in terms of concrete built and not just sheds. These are serious.
Yeah, it was given protected building status not that long ago. Actually, all of these bunkers. Now, so what essentially happened? These are we've talked about and we've shared photographs, and you see the temporary gun emplacements where they've just got sandbags and stuff like that.
This is a major leap forward.
This is a major leap forward. They started on it in May, and it was already operational. According to German records, it was combat ready with the guns in permanent positions and most of the shelters for fire direction and ammunition and crew accommodation already completed. This was open concrete gun positions, but proper bunkers with 1.5 meter thick walls.
And these were big guns, and I think they were captured French guns, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. There was a variety of them, but they were captured French guns plus some smaller anti-aircraft guns and machine gun positions and things like that. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the area, this is, of course, the area where the commando raids happened in 1940. So that is possibly part of the reason they put them there.
But it is a prominent position over St. Peter Port as well. And I think if you got, we could give the listeners some sort of scale. They could throw shells miles. I mean, this is all range.
They could throw shells about 14 miles. So that's about 22 kilometers, something like that.
Yeah.
So they could throw shells quite a long way. So you're talking not quite halfway to Jersey, certainly over the other side of Sark, and so they're
covering the approaches to the island.
Yeah,
serious weaponry.
Yeah, covering the approaches. Now, for those of you familiar with the area, there is a whopping big monument there called the Doyle Monument. It's not the one that was there during the war,
indeed,
which was actually quite a lot taller. So it's if for those of you who aren't familiar, I'll put a photo up. It's just like a giant, I don't know, needle type shaped.
Yeah, Doyle was the military commander here at the very start of the 19th century, in the time of the Napoleonic threat. And this monument was placed up to commemorate his achievements on the island. And there's quite some famous photographs of it actually falling, and during the point of demolition.
So the Germans were actually originally using it for observation. So because you could go up it, the one that was there previous, and a nice sort of viewing platform near the top. Now, of course, if you've got a whacking great thing sticking up in the air, it's on high ground. It's pretty good for helping you when you want to target the gun battery that's about 100 meters away from said monument. So the actual commander of the Channel Coast turned up in November 1943, to do an inspection of the defences in the Channel Islands. And he made a couple of observations. Firstly, what the heck's that still doing there?
Oh, so that was still in place in 1943?
It was.
Even though Batterie Strassburg was operational in 1941?
Yeah.
I thought the monument was taken down at the point of the batteries. So it was actually stood there as a sort of rangefinder.
Yeah. And they hadn't at that stage, in June 41, they hadn't completed the bunker in the Jerbourg car park that looks out over the approach from Jersey.
Okay.
So that hadn't been completed at that point. That was,
and that's a big bunker as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That was later on. So they were using this for observation. But in November 43, this Vice Admiral Friedrich Reeve, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I'm really rubbish at German names, so apologies if I've completely pronounced that wrong. Anyway, he was the commander of the Channel Coast defences. He came along to inspect them, found them in good order, but he could see two problems with Batterie Strassburg. The first one was this whacking great monument. Not only was it attracting Allied aircraft, and actually while he was inspecting, there was a raid as he was actually here.
Right.
There was an Allied aircraft raid on St. Peter Port, and I think they strafed a little bit of Batterie Strassburg as well. And so he said, look, you're just attracting aircraft here. This is crazy. But his other objection was it was actually right in the way of one of their guns. So it was restricting the field of fire for one of their guns.
That's why I thought it had been taken down when the whole battery was coming together. Yeah.
No, I think it might have even been early 44 by the time they actually took it down. They basically blew it up, which seems like a very risky strategy given that you've got all of those ammunition bunkers and everything around there.
Yeah. So
I've got a photo of that where you can see actually what a problem it was for one of the gun emplacements. I'll put that up on our social media.
Yeah, and quite often, certainly Tim Osborne, who we've discussed before, who we're hoping he'll come on as a guest soon, he's very knowledgeable about Strasbourg. It's probably worth mentioning for the listeners as well about the Festung books. We should probably tweet a picture of
I can do that.
Because they're extraordinarily interested. I mean, if you're interested in fortifications and concrete and bunkers and such, and I know a lot of you out there are, I mean, it lists the reason, the raison d'etre, what military objectives of these, how they interact with other resistance nests and fortifications, the troop strengths, the weaponry, etc. They're mine of information, and they're well worth having.
Yeah, and I can put up the links to Festung Guernsey's website as well, which are it's got lots of photographs. There's also another site, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but a gentleman here who's gone around and photographed a lot of the bunkers inside and out.
Is that Ernie Gabay?
No, it's a different one actually. There's a website, I can't remember the gent's name now. I think it might be Steve something. Anyway, he's gone and taken photographs of them as they are now. So that's quite a good resource as well if you want to see what some of these places we're talking about look like.
Yeah, well, there's a few really, really interesting books, very detailed about the fortifications here.
Yep.
And I think we could probably put those up.
Yeah, we'll put the details for those as well.
Yeah, the Feston books, I think it's Clearview Publishing. I think there's a website for them as well.
Yeah.
Right, well, again, our hour is almost up. It's just absolutely incredible. So we're looking at July 41. Soon. We'll also have a couple of specials coming up. We're hopefully that Tim Osborne can guest. We're also hoping that Steve Foote will be able to guest soon because the Von Alpus diaries will be published very, very soon.
Out this month, I think.
I think so, the end of this month.
Couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, I've got my advanced copy. I'll be doing a book review for a couple of magazines about that. Well worth having. Tell us about Island Fortress. How's that going? Yeah,
that's going well. Islandfortress.com. I'm getting quite a lot of views on that, and also quite a few emails. So, in fact, I had an email from a gentleman yesterday whose grandfather was here during the occupation with the Luftwaffe, and he was wondering if I could help him out with a little bit of information. He was here constructing Luftwaffe gun batteries.
So, how can people get in touch with your blog? Access it?
If they go to islandfortress.com, they can contact me through there as a contact form, or you can just send me an email. The email details are on there. So get in touch with me through that.
Yeah, and I don't know how the listener is listening to this, but we're on Spotify, we're on Amazon, we're on a plethora of...
just about every platform that we can find. So.
But also we are, of course, part of Gnet Radio, which is an internet station that's funded and sponsored by Guernsey Arts. So you can also pick up not only this podcast on Gnet Radio, www.gnetradio.com. The Mixcloud Listen Again facility is there, and you can pick up a whole load of music shows, including an hour-long program called Rough and Rowdy Times, which is a musical companion to this show. It plays music from the war years and beyond. People can contact us, Nick, on occupied@gnetradio.com, and some people are sending some wonderful emails in. And we look ahead to July 41.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm going to be busy next weekend because I've got a friend of mine who's over from Wales, Kerry Thomas. He's coming over, so we're going to go and do a lot of visiting occupation sites and stuff. So there might be a few extra photos going out on the social media and stuff as well, which I'll put links to the social media in the show notes for this, so you can easily find them.
Excellent. Okay, so I think it's time to say goodbye. So goodbye from me, Keith Vigelli, and also goodbye from
Nick Lahire. Thanks very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you. And we play out again, of course, with Jim Delbridge's 5 to 7. So see you next time. Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.